Okay, I warmly welcome you all to this roundtable on realizing solidarity through international law. I am Cecilia Valle, professor at the Department of Public International Law of the University of Oslo in Norway. It is a great privilege to be speaking and moderating this session with this esteemed group of speakers who exemplify the personalization of the right to solidarity in action and scholarship. And we are pre-recording this session on the very day that Russia launched a military assault on the Ukraine. And I wish to repeat the statement issued by ASOL President Catherine Amafar, expressing solidarity with the Ukrainian people and with others in the region who may be put in harm's way, calling for withdrawal of Russian forces and a return to peaceful resolution of the dispute. I will now give a brief introduction of the speakers of the roundtable. Maha Hilal is a scholar at the Institute for Policy Studies in DC, addressing human rights issues related to the war on terror, including the role of racism in prosecution, the consequences of Islamophobia, and the need to address causality of forced migration. Noura Erakat is a human rights attorney and an associate professor at Rutgers University. Her research interests include human rights law, humanitarian law, national security law, refugee law, social justice, and critical race theory. Her publications include Racism, Whiteness, and Burnout in Anti-Racism Movements, How White Racial Justice Activists Elevate Burnout in Racial Justice Activists of Color in the United States. Her multimedia productions include the Black Palestinian Solidarity video and website, as well as a multimedia production about Gaza in Context. And there's Nia Holston, is a lawyer and activist working at the Abolitionist Law Center, which seeks to end excessive criminalization policies and unjust convictions impacting minorities, denial of political rights to prisoners, death by incarceration, exposure of prisoners to toxic waste, denying them the right to a healthy environment, and solitary confinement. And then finally, Azadeh Shashani is a legal and advocacy director of Project South, which seeks to protect and defend immigrants and Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities. She is the author or editor of several human rights reports, including a 2017 report titled Imprisoned Justice, Inside 2 Georgia Immigrant Detention Centers, as well as law review articles and book chapters focused on racial profiling, immigrants' rights, and the surveillance of Muslim Americans. And moreover, she has served as an election monitor in Venezuela and Honduras. So welcome to all of you. Now, before we commence the discussion, I wish to give a brief introduction explaining the scope of the international right to solidarity. So international solidarity is the expression of a spirit of unity among individuals, peoples, states, and international organizations, encompassing the union of interests, purposes, and actions, and the recognition of different needs and rights to achieve common goals. The right to solidarity may be regarded as prompting a consciousness about the interconnectedness of peoples and recognition of our ability and responsibility, and this means pertaining to states, to non-state actors in civil society, to engage and to cooperate with each other to address transnational common challenges like climate change, man-made and natural disasters, pandemics, inequality, crime and corruption, the protection of refugees and asylum seekers, the protection of women subjected to violence, as well as those subject to detention. Now, currently, there's a draft declaration on the right to international solidarity that will be presented later this year to the UN Human Rights Council by the independent expert on international solidarity, Obafor Okafor. Now, Rosa Friedman has identified a second wave of third-generation rights, and that also includes the right to peace, recognized as a declaration by the UN General Assembly, the right to development, which is currently being elaborated into a convention, and the right to a healthy environment, recognized by the Human Rights Council. And this is a type of human rights imaginary that is representative of the legal traditions of the global South that are oriented towards group rights and collective duties. The aim is the emancipation of oppressed and vulnerable groups in order to guarantee the right to live with human dignity. So solidarity is closely tied to the freedoms of expression and association and assembly, because civil society groups often seek communication of their claims for recognition of the need to address violations through a variety of forums, including transnational platforms. Now, given the rise of polarization and fragmentation across societies at present, the key challenge for solidarity is how do we prevent it from being interpreted in an inclusive manner to sustain, exclusive manner rather, to sustain national nativist or intragroup segregated community orientations to the detriment of other groups. For example, Carol Gould identified the problem of unitary solidarity, and this may be exemplified by the rejection at the border of asylum seekers in the name of European solidarity. This is opposed to network solidarity, which seeks recognition of the overlapping cross-border local to global solidarity initiatives, demonstrating a common empathy, such as environmental civil society groups, in one country calling for demilitarization, in other groups addressing labor rights or women's rights across borders. So I turn now to the panel to discuss concrete examples of solidarity actions in practice, identifying both progress and remaining challenges. So I'll start with Maha Hilal. So you have called for an end to war and militarism as a show of solidarity towards the 82.4 million forcibly displaced persons in the world. And the head of the Norwegian Refugee Council, Jan Egeland, has called for an increase in donations to humanitarian organizations, which remain severely underfunded compared to the generous funding given to military weaponry. And moreover, he underscores the long drawn out nature of forced displacement. For example, the current large elderly displaced communities in the Ukrainian border territories have been subject to shelling and lack water and electricity and services since 2014. And he also gave a speech in the UN Security Council in which he addressed the plight of fourth generation Palestinian inhabiting a refugee camp established 73 years ago in Lebanon, and the fact that the first Syrian refugee babies born in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley or in Jordan's Zatari camp are now 10 years old. So my question to you is, how do we design a solidarity strategy to address protracted situations that might not be war, but rather unpeace, as identified by Mark Leonard?
Well, thank you, Cecilia, and thank you to ASIL for hosting this panel. I want to start with a quick correction. I am no longer with the Institute for Policy Studies. I am actually a researcher, scholar, and just published a book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, Islamophobia, the War on Terror and the Muslim Experience Since 9/11. So just wanted to clarify, because there is an awesome fellow, Flory Peterson-Smith, who's there now. So, I think that this is a really interesting question. And I want to quick start with the idea of unpeace as I understood it from Peter Leonard. And his idea of unpeace is sort of this space between war and peace. But what he's talking about is, in some cases, state violence, but in other cases, this idea of non-state actor violence that is kind of contributing and filling in the gaps for many of the conflicts we see around the globe. And what he's specifically talking about is violence that arises from globalization and connectivity, and the ways in which resources, in some cases, are leveraged by one state over another, and in some cases, one non-state actor over another, to kind of influence and contribute to conflict. This, he says, as some of us have understood what conflict means, what war means, is sort of taking the place of what we understand as traditional warfare. Right? We have this idea, and we've had this idea, that traditional warfare is about troops on the ground. It's about an official start of a war. It's about ending a war with peace treaties, etc. And he talks about how this is no longer sort of as visible and no longer how we really fight wars. So, I was reflecting on his concept of unpeace and the question in particular that you asked. And, I think my conceptualization of war kind of differs slightly, because when we talk about fourth generation Palestinians and when we talk about Syrian refugees, in my mind, they are still in active war. Because to me, war is not just about troops on the ground. War is about living in a precarious state. War is about the threat of violence, the constant threat of violence. War is about insecurity, and war is specifically about, right, a state actor having power and leverage over non-state actors. And so I think that my concept of war kind of differs slightly. And what he's talking about, again, is more about connectivity issues that cause conflict, whereas the examples that you've given in the question are specifically about the problem of state violence. So I think that there's, a slightly different way we need to interpret how we think about war. And this is something that I've spoken about a lot in the context of the war on terror, for example, because the United States constantly says the war in Afghanistan is over, the war in Iraq is over, but we know that that's not the case. We know that there are still troops on the ground. And even if there weren't troops on the ground, we know that there would still be the threat of violence from the United States and other state actors. So I think this question to me partly is about really the question of how do we actually understand war? And if we understand that fourth generation Palestinians are still living in a state of war, how do we then create and think about solidarity tactics? So to me, this concept of unpeace is, again, a little different than how I would conceptualize the situations and examples that we're talking about. And so if we really think about refugees, fourth generation refugees, Syrian refugees in the context of active war, then what needs to happen fundamentally is that there has to be accountability, right? And this is important for many reasons. Number one, to redress the harm that has been caused. And number two, because in a lot of these situations, Palestinians, among many others, right, war constructs people as monsters, and they're demonized, they're criminalized. And these constructions impact the extent to which other communities, other people, other states can show and do show solidarity with these individuals and these communities. So I think, again, that's sort of a twofold thing. One is, again, accountability, and the other is to specifically deconstruct these ideas about who those, those who have been harmed and impacted by the violence are being constructed. And we know part of the state's strategy in continuing and perpetuating violence is to continuously demonize and criminalize communities so that they can continue the harm, and also so that they can decrease and sort of disengage the global community from being able to show solidarity towards these communities. So I think that, there are a lot of, again, important things that we need to talk about when we talk about traditional warfare ending. And in that vein, again, how do we think about this in the context of solidarity? And how do we really get people to understand that war may look different now, but we can also redefine how we think of what war is, because that is imperative to how we think of intervening in situations and conflicts that continue to cause massive harm to Palestinians, to Syrians, and many other marginalized communities around the world.
Those reflections give us a very good connection to the work that Noura Erakat is involved with. So I'm going to turn to Noura now. There's a perception that transnational solidarity may be easier for people in the sense that they demonstrate effective solidarity for people subject to oppression in other nations than to exhibit empathy for other groups within their own nations. And this is due to political polarization or class divisions, religious antipathies, and racism. So it may be suggested that nations are increasingly facing an internal crisis of fragmentation of common values. And you have addressed the Black Palestinian solidarity and described them as entwined struggles for freedom. So given that the Black Lives Matters group was actually defunded on account of their transnational support for the Palestinian struggle, can you offer some reflections on the costs and benefits of engaging in solidarity actions at the domestic level versus at the transnational level?
Thank you, Cecilia. Thank you to everyone. I'm excited to be here today and join you in this discussion, and perhaps to come back to these ideas of, I was thinking about at the prompt, solidarity found in international law, and where that's found and how that's enshrined, for example, in thinking about, collective security as the exception to the prohibition on the use of force, and third-party interventions as being legal so far as they are being called for by a recognized sovereign, and so on and so forth. So I'll put a pin in that. And I also just want to emphasize what Maha was saying, if I may, Dr. Hilal, on this dehumanization, right? What is it that mitigates the response to harm to certain communities? I've been keen to emphasize that this is not, that the dehumanization is actually part of a racist and colonialist project, that it's precisely what creates the expectation that certain communities will suffer. We are trained to accept the suffering and the death and the harm to certain communities. And that happens through a process of racialization, which creates perceptions of inferiority where the victim actually deserves the harm that they receive, as well as colonialism, which creates a structure of superiority as well, whereby the harm inflicted by the colonial power is framed as righteous, as necessary, right? Where the harm they create is collateral damage, as opposed to, and similarly inferiorizes and racializes the Native population so that we are not as triggered by mass numbers of their deaths. So I just want to emphasize that and say that, yeah, I agree. And I think that it's related to these very structural processes. As to this concept of transnational solidarity and domestic solidarity, I want to complicate that a little bit as well. One of the things that I've found in my own practice as well as study of Palestinian transnational solidarity writ large, in particular with Black communities in the United States, is that this is not an identity politics, right? This isn't about Palestinians by nature of being Palestinian and Blacks by nature of being Black in the United States are finding kinship with one another. To the contrary, there are multiple fragmentations in and between them. So that in one of the first projects, I've been doing this for decades. Before we called it intersectionality, we just called it joint struggle, right? But one of the things that I found when we put out that video in 2014 on Black Palestinian solidarity was a lot of angry reactions where our Palestinian audiences were offended that we were claiming to be in joint struggle with Black communities who they saw as some, I'm not saying all, but some of the reaction was that they are thugs, right? Because here they are in the United States, they are adjacent to whiteness, they have a commitment to white supremacy, and have accepted that the condition of Black people in the United States is one that they deserve as well. They too have accepted these racializations. Similarly, we received many critiques from Black audience members who didn't want to be compared to Palestinians because unlike Palestinians, they never lobbed a rocket onto white people the way that Hamas uses rockets. So why are you comparing us to terrorists when we've been nonviolent? And this reflects a positionality, right? Also of privilege, of being within the heart of empire, regardless of how you're situated, you are perpetuating harm. I am perpetuating harm, right? Through the payment of my taxes that funds these wars, as well as the fact as accruing the privileges of being in the wealthiest country, global superpower, right? Where I am benefiting from these imperial structures. And so it obfuscates our positionality. So I raise that anecdotal example only to say that transnational solidarity or domestic solidarity does not reflect an identity politics, but reflects a political orientation. It is a commitment to politics. And so I've identified it that Black Palestinian solidarity is actually an anti-imperial analytic, and that it conjoins not Blacks and Palestinians, but Black leftists and Palestinian leftists. So that the same Palestinians who are adjacent to whiteness and benefiting from white supremacy in the United States, unless and we must take a position against it, that politics should lead them to critique the United States as a settler colony, to critique its ongoing settler colonization of native lands. Professor Nick Estes had a brilliant analysis on Twitter describing that the US's intervention in the crisis in Ukraine is one that seeks to expand its market for oil exports in Europe among Western Europeans that sidelines Russia. How is that reflected in the US? Precisely through native lands, right? The Dakota Access Pipeline, the Line 3 pipeline, that is continuing to encroach on indigenous sovereignty, right? How you have that analysis reflects a politics, not an identity. Though your identity and your proximity to certain state violence might prime you to better be able to see it. In the same way that Black leftists in the United States would be able to see that, and also be able to see that the US's commitment to Israel, right? And US commitment to what has been abundantly shown by Palestinian scholars, activists, and now mainstream human rights organizations as an apartheid regime, is one that also benefits US imperial interests and not necessarily one of solidarity or commitment to combat anti-Semitism.
To follow up then, Michelle Garwick suggests that if we're going to be successful at these solidarity actions, she says that you need to also have separate collective actions by the dominant groups. So she points to examples of having Israelis supporters of Palestinians, or white Americans supportive of African Americans, or men supportive of women's rights, because precisely they may have an ability to engage in protest actions with a greater scope of freedom than the Palestinians or the African Americans who may be subject to risk because of excessive security measures taken upon them. What are your reflections on this? You agree with that perspective? Yeah, no, I'm still talking to you.
Okay. I couldn't agree more that obviously the participation of dominant groups often becomes the moment at which we see a shift. I also want to emphasize that creates a burden, right? Because the dominant groups, whether you've described Israelis, whites, men, right, are all benefiting from a particular privileges, right, that have been obfuscated and naturalized and normalized in law and society and so forth. So to actually have them not only relinquish those privileges, but similarly to be able to critically scrutinize the conditions in which they exist requires a tremendous amount of unlearning and political consciousness. That burden often falls on the impacted group, whereby I, as a woman, am now responsible for breaking down patriarchy to men in a way where they want to respond and say, but look, you're empowered, you speak, you're a professor, and then use these anecdotal examples to dismantle and obfuscate the structures by which patriarchy continues to operate. So I am very critical of where that burden lies and how we beseech that solidarity from the dominant groups. I also want to add that in the case of Palestinians specifically, one of the critiques that we get in boycott, divestment, and sanctions is that by waging this, we make it harder for Israelis to participate with us. So let us be clear. The state of Israel has purposefully and systematically chipped away and destroyed the Israeli left, punished them, criminalized them, driven them out, right? So they do not have the right to speak. It is against the law in Israel to commemorate the Nakba, or the Palestinian catastrophe, marking the establishment of Israel and the forced removal and exile of Palestinians, and calling for their right to return. Israel will criminalize that, as they have the organization Zochrot, which means remembrance in Hebrew, lock them in their offices so that they could not come out on the day to commemorate that remembrance. It is the state of Israel which has punished Israeli academics and threatened their tenure if they support boycott, divestment, and sanctions. That punishment is not coming from Palestinians. Or our request for solidarity at the grassroots level. That punishment is coming from the top, from state violence, similar to the way that it's being, the punishment is being meted out in the United States, where 41 out of 50 states have either passed or legislated anti-BDS laws to punish your participation in an international solidarity movement for human rights and justice. So yes, to obviously we want our allies to join us, but let's be wary of where that burden lies. Let's be critical of who's punishing that solidarity and diminishing it. And thirdly, let's remember, what Derek Bell has taught us, a critical race theorist, who has shown that convergence theory is often why dominant groups struggle, when it becomes beneficial to them, right? And so all of these should just embolden and empower us to continue to remember that there is a such thing as a universal truth, despite what postmodernist theory would have us believe. And in fact, there is a moral and righteous position.
Thank you, very eloquent. So both these presentations so far are focused on the importance of looking at state power. So I'm going to turn to Nia Holston now, because it's one of the ironies of the age of globalization and interconnectedness that we are actually witnessing an escalation in the use of state power in the form of solitary detention in prisons and immigration detention centers around the world. And states then justify their use of solitary confinement as disciplinary punishment for convicted prisoners or detainees, to isolate a detainee during the pretrial stage of investigation as part of a coercive interrogation, and is often applied to those suffering from mental illnesses, and has been applied also to migrants and pregnant women and teenagers. And studies have shown that solitary confinement causes anxiety, depression, anger, paranoia, psychosis, self-harm, and suicide. Prolonged isolation can destroy a person's personality and their mental health, and its effects may last long after the end of the period of segregation. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture issued a report in 2011 finding that solitary confinement longer than 15 days should be considered a violation of the UN Convention Against Torture. And it's well known that African Americans and Latinos have higher rates of solitary confinement, and that the use of solitary confinement increased by 500% during the COVID pandemic. So the Abolitionist Law Center is supporting, it's an organization of the Solidarity Not Solitary campaign. It took the case of Russell Marone Schultz, a 70-year-old who was locked in solitary confinement at various state prisons for 22 consecutive years and nearly 30 years non-consecutively. So as an example of network solidarity, the Nobel Peace Laureates, Jose Ramos Horta, Mairead Corrigan Maguire, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, Jody Williams, and Adolfo Perez Esquivel called for his release. And in May 2013, Schultz filed a federal civil rights lawsuit asserting that the state correctional officials were subjecting him to cruel and unusual punishment and violating his due process rights by continuing to subject him to such solitary confinement. So can you please discuss why the Schultz case was successful, and what are the lessons learned from pursuing a solidarity strategy which was grounded in the framework of constitutional law?
Yes, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be on this panel. I'm just learning so much from the panelists who've already gone. As you stated, I'm Nia Holston. I'm a staff attorney at the Abolitionist Law Center. I've been with ALC since 2021. And I think, it's so critical in talking about the system of mass solitary and the system of mass solitary as a form of social control to talk about the connections between solidarity strategies. And what we've learned is that it's so important and it's so powerful, because when an individual or group engages in solidarity strategies to obtain their freedom, we see this wave of mass repression and retrenchment, right? And so to that end, you brought up the case of my client, Mr. Russell Marone Schultz. Mr. Schultz was a Black liberation freedom fighter and political prisoner who was incarcerated for 49 years following his conviction for murder stemming from his political activities in Black liberation movements in Philadelphia. And he was sentenced to life without parole, or as we call it, death by incarceration, and spent, as you said, 31 years of prolonged solitary confinement. And I want to focus on this particular aspect of the death-making institution that is the system of mass incarceration, because it's important to note how the history of solitary confinement lends itself specifically to a reaction to Black political movements on the inside and outside as a form of social control, and specifically in Marone's case. And so, as you know, as solitary confinement became popularized in the 19th century and then subsequently declined as there became a more clear awareness of the profound moral harm that solitary confinement inflicted on people, even the Supreme Court identified as such in 1890. You saw this reemergence of solitary confinement, or the use of solitary confinement, in the 70s and 80s. And Jules Lobel, who wrote the article Mass Solitary and Mass Incarceration, specifically locates that as a response to Black-led political movements across the country, which led to the creation of the first control unit at USP Marion, which was a direct response to the organizing of incarcerated folks there to protest brutal conditions through work stoppages and other means. And so this idea of solitary confinement as a preventative measure, the idea of indefinite solitary confinement, which Marone experienced for 31 years, it is a direct response to the political work that people are doing on the inside, right? And I think it's important to note that Marone was in fact inspired by solidarity movements across borders, across international landscapes. And that was actually the reason why he was first placed in solitary confinement, right? It was precisely his activism with the Lifers organization and organizing to lobby for the end of life without parole sentences in Pennsylvania. And he was elected president of that organization. The day that he was elected president, he was sent to solitary confinement, right? And again, spent 31 years of continuous solitary confinement, right? And so we see this all across the country with the development of solitary confinement, not as incidental to the system of mass incarceration, but as completely, consistent with what we see generally, and consistent with what we see in Black-led political movements on the outside as well, right? So we know that, in response to Black-led political movements across the country, particularly in the South, we then see this rise in Confederate iconography, right? We see this rise of Confederate monuments that didn't exist really until the 1950s and 1960s, right? In a direct response to Black assertion of political power. And so I think that it's important to locate the construction of specific control units in supermax facilities across the country to this point where we are now in a situation where it's estimated that in 2014, there were 100,000 people in solitary confinement across the country. To the point where now in Pennsylvania, it's estimated that 1 out of every 11 Black men in Pennsylvania have experienced solitary confinement. That it's important that we locate that, this idea of, interest in connection with solidarity movements across the country as specifically threatening to the state, right? And so I think it's just really important to note how powerful it is, because the state always responds to it in that way, right? And we know that the state is engaged in solidarity strategies, what we call solidarity strategies of their own, right? They're constantly looking at other countries, other nations to understand, how they enact their own violence, right? And to get inspiration from them, right? And so because it is so powerful, we have to do that as a group within ourselves, on the inside and on the outside. So I just think it's incredibly, incredibly important. So ALC won the release of Marone in 2014. He was released from solitary confinement. And we did that work alongside of thousands of organizers across the country and across the world, as you mentioned, right? We did that work in connection with Juan Mendez, the UN Special Rapporteur on standards for torture, who testified in Marone's case and testified that the indefinite solitary confinement that he experienced was violative of international human rights standards, right? And in 2021, we won his release. So we were able to get him home through hospice transfer, or what is commonly known as compassionate release, due to his colorectal cancer. And he lived for 52 days after that, despite how the state treated him, despite how the lack of medical care and affected him. It was so good to see him home. And so I think it's just important to name that case and name that particular example as far as the larger movement of solitary movement towards solitary confinement in the U.S. and how we see it as a direct response to political movements in this country.
Yes, a profound challenge for a society, and I can't believe that there's any room not to engage immediately. I think that this is something that the entire country must get involved with. Like Maha was discussing, you become normalized, that you cease to understand that the situations are absolutely of utmost urgency because the violation of human dignity is so devastating. And I thank you for that very clear presentation of our challenge. I'll move now to Sadeh Shashashani. Nia just described that we have a real concern for the rule of law, which is absolutely diminishing around the world because we see that democracy is receding and judicial independence is increasingly under threat while human rights violations are escalating. So groups and individuals who are targeted and even assassinated for their engagement to denounce corruption, to denounce impunity, to discuss damage to the environment or attacks against marginalized groups such as indigenous people and migrants and minorities. They fear that there's no possibility of access to justice because a state of impunity is being maintained through a dysfunctional political and judicial system. So as a day when I was looking at your work, I was really, really intrigued because you participated in sort of an alternative form of justice. You participated in people's tribunals in Mexico, the Philippines, and Brazil. And I'm wondering, can you offer some reflections on the contribution of these parallel alternative mechanisms for solidarity justice?
Thank you very much, Cecilia, for that introduction. And I also wanted to thank my fellow panelists, Noura, Maha, and Mia, for their powerful remarks. Before I start talking about people's tribunals, I did want to thank Mia again for their campaign to end solitary. And I remember two men who died after being placed in solitary confinement at the Stewart Detention Center in the state of Georgia, which is where I am. Giancarlo Alfonso Jimenez Joseph, who was a 27-year-old, and Efrain de la Rosa, a 40-year-old. They both died of suicide after being placed in solitary confinement for several days. So instead of providing them the care, the mental health care that they needed, the private prison corporation placed them in solitary confinement. And I hope that, the tragedies at Stewart and elsewhere in the country are put to a stop when we are successful in our collective campaign to abolish solitary and really to abolish all prisons and jails. And so I'm happy to talk about people's tribunals. I did want to say that I've also participated in domestic people's tribunals, including the one on the Muslim ban, which I'm going to talk about shortly. I don't want people to think that people's tribunals are only used in the international context. In fact, in New Orleans, after Katrina, a people's tribunal was organized to investigate police violence against and criminalization of Black people. So people's tribunals are forums for justice initiated by grassroots organizations, social justice movements, organizers, lawyers, and academics. The forums provide a space to adjudicate charges against the state outside of the formal judicial system. And unlike proceedings that involve a state bodies, such as congressional investigations or litigation, people's tribunals are not beholden to government bureaucracy in their truth-finding and exposing missions. So one of the first people's tribunals that we know about was the Russell Tribunal, which was held in the 1960s and looked into the crimes of the US government in Vietnam. And the format of these tribunals typically mirror that of a trial. So lawyers typically take up the roles of prosecutors and defense attorneys. Community members, legal scholars, and judges act as jurors. And individuals directly affected by the legislation or issue at hand come forward to provide testimony describing their experiences. And though these tribunals do not hold legal authority themselves, they do help gather evidence. Documentation is really important. That can later be used by judicial forums such as the International Criminal Court. So the ICC has the authority to take on cases or launch investigations based on information that is brought to light through a tribunal. Alternatively, people's tribunals can help develop a stronger foundations to launch more effective subsequent domestic federal investigations. And further, these tribunals serve important accountability goals by directing international attention to grave abuses of human rights in various countries and by forcing governing bodies and the public to reckon with national histories. So for example, in 2016, the International Tribunal for Democracy in Brazil, which I was honored to participate in, called attention to a situation quickly spiraling into fascism, when then Socialist President Dilma Rousseff was unjustly impeached and former Vice President Michel Temer took over without holding elections. The US's long history of white supremacy and really oppressive pieces of legislation like the Muslim ban that really is rooted in that history can be addressed in present day through tribunals where witnesses can also make the case for remedy in the form of reparations. Finally, people's tribunals differ from formal judicial proceedings in that one of the tribunals' primary purposes is to give priority to the narratives of those directly affected. So these narratives are often in danger of getting buried when they are up against the voices of state officials in lengthy and complex judicial and legislative processes. The stories of directly impacted people need to be told in forums that center and honor the individuals who live through them. So I did want to focus on three specific tribunals very briefly, just to give you all a sense of what tribunals have achieved in recent years. So as I mentioned, I've been involved in a tribunal focused on the Muslim ban that was held in Atlanta in the fall of 2017. So when the Supreme Court decided to postpone the hearing on the second version of the Muslim ban, we in Atlanta decided that we're not going to wait for the Supreme Court. We're going to organize our own people's tribunals. And of course, we pulled together a jury of community members and the prosecution team. And then obviously, most importantly, were the directly impacted folks and organizations. So representatives from the Somali community organizations, for example, showed up and talked about the real pain that the community was experiencing as a result of the separations due to the Muslim ban. And several other folks also testified. And so then the jury, after deliberation, came back with a verdict of guilty against the Trump administration and against the Muslim ban. And of course, the Supreme Court in June of 2018 decided that the Muslim ban is perfectly fine, which is a shameful decision that I have no doubt will be struck down at some point in the future, like the Korematsu decision was. But nonetheless, we and the community really appreciated the verdict of the People's Tribunal that heard the what the community, the pain and the suffering that the community experienced as a result of the Muslim ban, and that documentation that the jury came up with can hopefully be used by a future forum to look into the constitutionality and the legality of the Muslim ban. Then there are a couple of tribunals on the Philippines that I was honored to be involved with. So one of them in Brussels, and it was really amazing how much work had gone into documentation. And the jury was presented with, literally thousands of pages of evidence of the human rights violations by the Duterte regime, with the direct support of the US government, of course. And so, afterwards, the day after the lawyers, the day after the verdict was rendered, the Filipino lawyers went to The Hague and went to Geneva with a very, huge amount of evidence that they had brought to Brussels, as well as the verdict of the jury. And then we, as the jury, went to the consulate of the Philippines in Brussels. And it was very interesting because at first they didn't want to let us in. We were a group of 10 or 12 very peaceful individuals. They had actually mobilized, called the police. And so the police showed up with, guns and shields. And then when they saw, what we were about to, what we wanted to do, they kind of backed off. And so eventually we were able to get into the consulate. So what was really interesting was that, Duterte had given a speech completely dismissing the tribunal as a farce. But, it was very clear from, what the consul general was saying after we had the opportunity to meet with him, that they were very carefully monitoring what we were doing. Because he was saying that, I heard you all speaking in a foreign language, and what were you saying? Because at the end of the tribunal, when we rendered the verdict, people were chanting, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido, the people united shall never be defeated. And so obviously they had been very concerned about the proceedings of the tribunals and had watched every minute of it, which can tell you, how much dictatorial regimes are actually concerned about the proceedings of these people's tribunals. And then the last example, which I, clearly remember and has, really, for me, it really, drove home the importance of people's tribunals. At another people's tribunals focused on the Philippines, which was actually held in DC, after 3 days of proceedings, when the jury had finally rendered its verdict and everything. So that evening, there was a celebration, and we were all hanging out. And so one of the witnesses to the tribunal, a seasoned human rights organizer and survivor of human rights violations, she approached me and she said, after you as the jury gave the verdict of guilty against the regime and the US government for its human rights violations against us, I couldn't help but cry, because this was the first time that any type of body had actually took the time to listen to what we had suffered, and based on the evidence that was presented to it, decided that what they had done to us was wrong, that they had actually committed human rights violations against us, and they're guilty. So I think that right there, shows you why people's tribunals are important, where there's no other judicial forum available for aggrieved people to talk about what they have suffered. People's tribunals serve that clear purpose. And I do want to share a resource on people's tribunals. I'll maybe share it in the chat, and hopefully it can be shared with participants. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This presentation was very illuminating in terms of describing the importance of having civil spaces for engagement, for advocacy. And we witness concern almost consistently from all of the human rights special rapporteurs working on these issues, that the civic spaces appear to be decreasing. And there's a parallel concern about social media largely being dominated by right-wing orientations and liberal voices being made peripheral. So I'd like to invite the panel, any of you who would like to maybe give some insight as to how you see the civic space and the role of social media, and whether we should actually engage more with the companies that are running the social media platforms in terms of ensuring the safety and the openness of the civic spaces, and also protecting from right-wing interest groups that may be seeking to limit the engagement of the left on the platforms. So please, any of you.
I mean, I'll just chime in really quick that I think you're stating something that we all know, which is that as much as we want to say that social media has provided the democratization of the media space and allowed for more inclusion, which on some levels is undeniable, it's also not absent of intervention, right? It's kind of like Ruha Benjamin's work on race after technology. There are algorithms that are built into these social media platforms, whether it's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or otherwise, that work to monitor and police and punish the work of marginalized groups already. Power is reproduced in these algorithms, which then, function outside of actual intervention. Then add to that the resources that the right does have in order to harass and to punish and to flag. So I am part of, as a Palestinian community in the Palestinian digital world, directly incurred harm as a result of this, where our posts are taken down regularly, often without a basis, but because there is time and money that our opposition has in order to flag and remove our posts, which creates a state of harassment. The same way that some right-wing groups have used FOIA requests of academics at public universities, oftentimes baseless. It's just wasting our time. It is a harassment tactic. We have engaged as Palestinian advocates with Facebook directly when they wanted to change their social media platforms so that they would flag and remove any critiques of Zionism. I mean, talk about one of the, experts, scholars are not in agreement over Zionism, anti-Semitism, its relationship to racism. These are the ongoing discussions in the literature. And yet here was Facebook about to equate certain hashtags with being anti-Semitic and Zionist. And literally, I mean, if it wasn't for our engagement, which didn't convince them at all, right? We didn't convince them to change their policy, but we made it abundantly clear that they were not equipped to make these decisions, that there was no way that they could get it right. As if, because it's ongoing. So yes, I do encourage that engagement. I also think it's an uphill battle, and one that's rife with ethical questions that push on the limits of free speech, that push on the limits of what we think is democratic participation.
I would add to
Yeah, go
just
ahead,
what Noura said, and Noura expressed it brilliantly. But I think the problem sometimes with engaging with these companies is that we sort of assume they're moral actors and that they'll be convinced to do the right thing just because they should know what the right thing is. And obviously that's categorically false. We know that their interest is in making money, in profit, in capitalism. And so I think the strategy, if there is engagement, can't be, you're doing something wrong or this is unethical, right? It has to be, we are going to put pressure on you. We are going to shut this platform down. Whatever it is, it has to be about a tangible threat. Again, not treating them as though they're moral actors, because that strategy will inevitably fail. Because if they had the same moral or legal or ethical compass, right, they wouldn't be allowing what they allow on their platforms, and which persists, the violence persists. And clearly, if they were interested in removing harmful and violent content, they would, but they're not.
I only have just a brief addition. I mean, we see these social media platforms as an extension of the state in the way that they're used as tools of surveillance for the state specifically. And in my previous experience working as a public defender, I know that to be true. I know that agents of the state, whether that's parole, probation officers, court officers, prosecutors, whatever, are constantly mining the social media of my clients, right? Constantly mining it for information that they can use against them. And so I think that, you know, as we're having this conversation about right-wing groups, we also have to look at the ways that, you know, these social media platforms benefit from being an extension of the state, from the ways in which they make money from being an extension of the state. You know, of course, as Nora mentioned, you know, of course, we know that there are benefits to these social media platforms, and you know, particularly in like court packing examples, right? So having the public be at court in courtrooms to see the injustices that are happening, and to really does have beneficial effects on, you know, individual cases, right? And I believe personally had an effect on Marone's case when we won compassionate release for him. You know, there were many activists and organizers who through social media showed up, packed the court virtually. And, you know, I believe that had an effect. So I think, you know, there is that constant tension. And I think that, you know, being aware of it and being informed about it and being specific about what we want to change, you know, is important. But I think, you know, Dr. Halal is so right about how the capitalist forces are at play here, because these social media platforms are making money from being an extension of the state, from, you know, lifting up these right-wing platforms and organizations.
Mm. And Azadeh, can you come in then? How can we become autonomous in creating the spaces for ourselves if the ones that are created from the non-state actors and from the state are locking us out or controlling us? The examples you gave of the parallel justice, I thought were inspiring, precisely because it seemed so much that the people were making the spaces for themselves. So can you think of additional ways in those processes?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of communications, you know, Project South, the organization I work with, has really done some deep thinking in terms of, you know, providing forums for people to be able to, you know, share out information to support the movement. So we have a report on movement journalism, which I'll try to find and also share in the chat. And then there's also a network of you know, radio stations that are Black owned in the South, because, you know, in different parts of the South, the radio happens to be sort of the, you know, the primary mode of communication for a lot of folks. And so there's an attempt to kind of like, you know, to strengthen that network. So I think, you know, there's a lot of room in terms of, you know, being very creative in terms of, you know, building the spaces that are secure in terms of communications. And I did want to just add very briefly to what Nia was saying in terms of surveillance. You know, we have been subject of social media surveillance for sure ourselves. I mean, I posted a tweet last year around the hunger strike at the Stewart Detention Center, which I talked about. And within an hour, I got an email from a functionary at the local ICE office, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, basically demanding that I remove that tweet, which, you know, is like definitely a hallmark of authoritarian regimes, to like tell you what to do and then demand that you remove the tweet, which of course I didn't do because, you know, I'm fortunate, I'm a lawyer, I'm part of an organization. Our organization has a lawyer, you know, so like all of that. But I mean, imagine if I was an undocumented individual, not part of, you know, an organization, and getting this email from somebody who had the power to deport me tomorrow, how much fear that would put into you. So I think that's really something to pay attention to in terms of surveillance of the communication of immigrants, in particular, and those folks who advocate for you know, immigrants' rights as an extension of, you know, COINTELPRO and sort of, you know, the surveillance state mechanisms that have been developed and perfected over the past century or so.
Thank you, and that is a very good note to end the panel on. It's been absolutely fascinating to hear from all of you for your reflections of solidarity in practice. And I find it very inspiring, and I really hope that the members of ASIL that will be attending the conference will gather to reflect on new ways we can follow your example. Thank you so much for your service to civil society and for the aspiration of emancipating those most vulnerable within the United States and abroad. So we end the session on this very positive note. Thank you.